Good afternoon. We will get this underway. So, welcome to the final in this U3A seminar series. It's been a unique experience, especially for us putting this on, because as you're aware, the circumstances were bestowed on us by a little creature, airborne creature that none of us have seen. But we've actually had to expand our repertoire quite extensively to be able to cope with putting in another venue and to widening out to another audience. It's possible that in the future, I quite like doing this stuff, and it gives us this opportunity to reach a wider audience. And if COVID hangs around, it gives us the opportunity to keep the spacing, etc. going. So there's a very good possibility that this will become the norm rather than us moving back across the road. So let's just see what happens. We're incredibly indebted to the Crossroads Church staff for what they've done for us. Basically, at short notice, we were moved from a space over there that had a projector and a screen into something that actually would probably fly the space station. I'd also like to acknowledge the U3A group that put these on. There's quite a bit of work making them work like a clockwork mouse like they do, and it's really nice that they're so seamless. I'd just like to make a special mention to Stuart, our person who looks after our speakers and our topics. Exceptional again, Stuart. Sorry, you're going to have trouble bettering yourself if you don't put a cap on this. Thank you very much. So today's talk, just like the last three, has been streamed, so you can watch it again on YouTube. The URL's on the flyer. Also, if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, if you email it to me, I'll send it back to you. Toilets, out either door at the back. Keep going once you turn right or left, and there'll be signage out there. In the event of an emergency, please evacuate via the emergency doors and head into the car parks. There's one at that end of the building and one at that end of the building. Just stay there and we'll sort it out after that. Due to COVID, there's no afternoon tea. But since normally what we did at afternoon tea was we had the opportunity for you to write questions down. Since we can't do that at the moment, if you've got a question, write it down so you don't forget about what it is, and then afterwards there'll be an opportunity to ask the questions of Kirsten. But when you do, just put your hand up and somebody will bring you a microphone. That enables the people in the room to hear, but also the broadcast. But using a microphone, they work really well if you communicate well with them. They don't work very well if you don't. So stay in touch with it, all right? So our speaker today is Kirsten Holst, geriatrician. She's working at MidCentral DHB. Her topic is healthy aging and what really matters in the end, thinking about prolonging the quality of life. A topic which I'm sure will ring a lot of bells for people in this room. So Kirsten's lived in this area for over 30 years, and she chose to be a geriatrician because she loved the stories she heard about other people's lives. She acknowledges her own aging process and has personal experience of family using health services, which she maintains has sharpened her focus on adding life to years. Kirsten's a geriatrician at MidCentral Health, as I said, in a specialist role. She's devoted a good part of her life since 1989 when she moves to Palmerston North, so a local star. So she spends some days in Horowhenua and some days in the Star 4 at Palmerston North Hospital. She says she's also used to hearing people say they don't want to become her patients. It's a nice thing, but she says we should be pleased we are aging day by day because the other option is death, and growing older is a privilege. She's likened our health to a game of kerplunk, glorified pickup sticks. Some actions might slow the sticks being pulled out, such as reducing stress, and some might put a stick back in, such as an operation. She says that our late teens and early 20s are the peak of our lives for most of our body systems, but older people can have excellent quality of life if they approach it in the right way and have people around them to help them. People often think about winning, a massive lotto win, but not everybody thinks about dying. Yet it is one of life's certainties. Kirsten's one of several geriatricians who have spread the message of advanced care planning in the community, which enables people to have some say in their own care at the other end. Interesting, as we stand here, Kirsten and I have a recipe cooking in my slow cooker, which came out of your mum's book, Slow Food Fast. I'm cooking macaroni cheese for dinner if anybody's interested. So to present our final seminar in this series, I'd like to introduce Kirsten Holst.
Oh, good afternoon. It's very nice seeing you all here. It's very odd seeing you all with your masks on. But that's okay, we can manage this. Oh dear, that's a bad start, isn't it? Right, we're there. So, I am going to talk about some of the things that I'm interested in within the field of geriatrics. I guess that while I work for the DHB, I feel I should disclaim that I'm not necessarily talking about all their views as far as things goes. These are mine. But I don't think that they're too far off most of the other geriatricians that work in New Zealand either. As I said, I'm ageing, we all are, and it's a privilege to be ageing. I have two people in my life that have really made me focus on things about quality of life. My mum has quite significant dementia and is in residential care now. And her dementia journey has been over almost 15 years now, which is a long time. And one of the things that's really tricky for me around that is that this is something that I do deal with a lot in my day-to-day work. But when you're dealing with anything personally, you do focus on it in a different way. And I'm very, very grateful. I love my mum and dad very dearly. And while my mum has had a diagnosis of dementia for some time, until recently, she was able to live a very full life at home. Things have got a little bit more difficult now, and I guess that one of the things about it is having a diagnosis like this isn't a full stop in your life, it's a comma. And we were in a situation where we were able to recognise that this was going to be a problem and focus very much on maximising quality of life and doing things while we were able to and enjoying time together, as I say, while we were able, and that's just been huge. The other thing is that I've been widowed for about 2 years now. My husband had prostate cancer, and he had some very aggressive chemotherapy for that, which was successful in controlling his cancer, but made him quite frail. And he fell over and broke his hip, another of the things that I do quite a lot of in my day-to-day work. And after he had rehabilitation for that, a month after that he had a very big stroke, and that left him unable to speak, which is tricky for anyone, but particularly unpleasant if you've been a lawyer and used to giving people instructions for your life. So that was tricky, and I would have said prior to his having had the stroke that would be the last thing that I would want to have happen to me. But we also had 2 really brilliant years of life that we enjoyed very much together after that, and it was again a useful thing to realise that it was a comma and not a full stop. But I was very pleased that we'd done when it had the cancer diagnosis, we'd done some discussions about what was important to us, and so I am going to talk about advanced care planning a little bit later on. today. So, as I say, my opinions are very much shaped by those experiences in my life, as well as by the amazing stories and people that I meet on a day-to-day basis at the hospital. So, this is Peter Pan. Peter Pan didn't ever grow old, or didn't want to ever grow old. It's a statue. This particular statue was a photo of the statue in the Dunedin Botanical Gardens, and it's been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And there's a little mouse and a little snail that are down the bottom of the statue that I was always particularly fond of. So I like the idea of Peter Pan and his never growing up. But as I say, I think that growing old is such a privilege. Okay, so one of the things is, it turns out I quite like graphs, and so I'm sorry that there are a few graphs coming up at the moment. And I think that the thing that's important about this one is that over the last 150 years, there has been a significant change in the average life expectancy all around the world. And you can see that things have shot up there. So prior to that, the average top line that there is over 150 years ago was about 25, 35. You know, that was the average life expectancy, and it has gone up, and it is probably plateauing. But people can expect to live a lot longer now. Really, the things that's tricky about this is, you know, I'd like to be able to say as a doctor, you know, it's medicine that's made a big change to that. But in fact, a lot of those changes are societal, and it's that we have better hygiene, we have better food availability. And a lot of what's actually changed isn't at the geriatric end of it, it is actually change in perinatal, so babies and women having babies, maternal mortality rates have dropped very significantly. You know, until we'd got into COVID, we'd sort of thought maybe we were out of, particularly in a country like New Zealand, that infection wasn't a big cause of death. But in fact, it is worldwide. Things like malaria and TB are still big killers, AIDS, and of course we've had COVID. But a lot of those, as I say, the things that happened earlier were there. You know, medically, technology and medications and things like that, there have been some changes with that. But it's a lot of what we're seeing are that people are aging with chronic conditions, so that there are illnesses that don't necessarily kill you, or they don't kill you fast. You live with them for a long time. And there's a lot of autoimmunity, and I think that probably within the discussions about diet, there's been discussions about the bowel flora and things like that, which I think are probably we're going to find have quite an impact on autoimmunity in the future, and I think that this is just a place that we need to watch the spot. And also, we've got a lot of treatments now for things like cancer, so that these are things that have a significant impact. This is just a graph that I thought was interesting, and up the top is the people in New Zealand, and it's only over quite a short period of time, I'm sorry, but this is a trend, that there are a lot of people that choose not to have children, or to have fewer children than we did in the past, which is one of the things that contributes to what we call the coffin-shaped graph. When you look at this, that we're I think I've got one. This is, in fact, for the Maori population, where this was how things would have looked for a lot of people previously in a lot of countries, that there's a large number of people at the bottom and fewer people at the top. And I'm just going to go back. What we're seeing now is that because we're having smaller families, there's this bulge moving up, and it makes it into apparently a coffin shape, which I guess you have to be a little bit imaginative to see that as a coffin, but that's what it is. So, we're moving up, we're getting older. I'm not going to talk a lot about the differences between Māori and Pākehā health, other than to recognise that the advances that we've made within our society isn't equal across different ethnic groups, and that the Māori still lag behind, and we need to be working harder on that. Okay, so, when we're thinking about life, most of the time I think that we want to think that we're going to live life functioning at a high level for as long as possible. And then quite a few people say, well, we'd like to go along at a high level and then, have something sudden happen. It might be we don't want to be hit by a bus, but, sudden heart attack, and you die. You don't have a lot of time when the function is poor. And this can be shown graphically with this, so that we've got relatively high function, goes along, maybe a little bit of a drop off, but then we have a relatively sudden end in a time where we might be more dependent. So up this way, high function, low dependence on other people, and when we're down this end, this is where you're less able to do things, and that you might be more dependent on other people. Okay, so often people think, well, that's how we all trundle along. But unfortunately, when we're talking about the situation where there are more people with chronic conditions, the graph sort of looks a little bit more like this one, where function has come down a bit, but then there'll be something that goes wrong. And one of the things that this graph might be looking at or showing would be somebody with something called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So lung problems and the dips when you drop down. That might be when you get a chest infection. You might end up in hospital for that. But in fact, you get better again, but maybe not up to quite the same level as you were before. Things trundle along. There could be more dips like that. Okay, and as I say, we've got this aging population. A lot more of the situation is like this. Then we've got the condition, and it's with time. We don't. Oops. We've ended at this point, but things are going down. We don't necessarily know where things have been before that. It might have been at quite a high function. It might have quite suddenly dropped down. That could be something like having a stroke. It could be like having a big heart attack, and this could be like problems with heart failure as well, where things might be tricky. And I think that it's important to think about the fact that living longer doesn't necessarily mean that you're living longer with a high quality of life. What we need to do is we need to actually to work to make sure that we're having quality living. And this is one of the bits that's just a little bit disheartening about looking at things as far as ageing goes. So, oops, I'm very sorry that I'm so technologically challenged and can't keep the fingers on the right buttons. This is at the top end of where we're at, that graph that we were talking about where we know that life expectancy is increasing. So average age is going up. Males and females, it is different. Women do live longer. But this bit here is people who are living well and being independent. These are people that need some help, and these are people that are more dependent and need help from others to do things in their daily life. And I think that it's what we'd like to see is that we'd like it all to be the dark blue side of things, that you're aging, living well, But unfortunately, we might be living longer, but it's not all as independent as we'd like it to be. So I think that that's just one of the things that we need to think about, maybe as a reality of life, that, while we'd like to stay as well as we can, or as well as we are, that might be going to be something that changes. And what I'm going to be trying to talk about with some of these other things is about how we can boost the time in the dark blue area and minimise the times in the lighter boxes up the top. Sorry, I should have actually said, I know that we're going to do this with time for questions, but if I say something that really just doesn't make sense to you, you're allowed to wave your arms around and ask me to explain a little bit more as we're going as well, if that's needed. So, as I say, I like my graphs. And this one is an indication, I guess, of the respiratory system and how things might go on that journey again, where we're looking at maximal sort of functioning and how things might decline with time. So, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, that's when your body's actually at its fittest. Your balance is best then. It is the time that, biologically we should have been breeding and doing those sorts of things. We've got more resilience then. And things do deteriorate or do drop off in function. So this is just saying that your lung function is probably going to deteriorate with time. Now, down the bottom here, this is an area where you might have symptoms of breathlessness. If you're in this zone, you might have symptoms of breathlessness when you're walking 100 metres. Maybe up here it's going to be you can still run 100 metres before you feel breathless. But here it's when you're walking. Here it's when you're really very limited. And what we know about smoking and effect with lungs is that for susceptible people, and not everyone is susceptible to smoke, so some people can smoke and not damage their lungs. They will still be on this pathway up here. But a lot of people who smoke will damage their lungs, and your lung function comes down sooner. And you will hit an area where you become breathless. And here, breathless with very minimal effort, and might be going to actually die. Okay? These are lines saying that if you stop smoking, having been a smoker who's susceptible to things, that it might slow down that rate of decline. So that, stopping smoking is one of the things that you can do to help your health right the way through. But if you stop earlier, you'll be potentially getting greater gains for things. Now, a lot of our systems work like this, so that our kidneys, we've got a lot more kidney function, a lot more filtering function to get ickies out of the blood than we need. But, your renal function will drop off as you get older as well. People say that maybe this is the same with your cognitive function. It might be going to drop a little bit. Your mind might not work quite as fast. You might not be in an area where you're actually having problems, which will be different percentages for different systems. But as I say, it may not be as good as it was when you were in your early 20s. So this sort of leads me on to talking about frailty. Now, frailty is a big thing, and it's tricky because it's not like just a heart attack or something like that you can be quite precise about. It is looking at a person often as a whole, and seeing that there are changes that can occur with those levels dropping down, and often it is when you get multiple things happening in your the system, multiple hits on things that contribute to the frailty picture. And one of the things about doctors is we like to be able to measure things. And one of the things that's tricky about frailty is that because you can become frail in different systems, and it will overall give you what we call a phenotype, a situation that you are frail. It isn't exactly the same. So we have difficulty, as I say, measuring these sorts of things. And it's, we can do things like grip strength. You can measure how hard somebody can squeeze a hand grip thing. Oh, name's just gone away. As maybe an indicator of frailty, but it's more complicated than that, and it's tricky when we're looking at how it affects things because it's a little bit nebulous, I guess. It's a misty thing out there rather than being a very definitive spot. But certainly, if you become frail, you're more likely to have problems with things going wrong in your system. So, as I say, one of the things, for instance, was my husband when he had the chemotherapy for his prostate cancer. It's a great thing for killing the prostate cancer, but it did make him frail. It affected his muscle strength and put some limits on the system. It actually gave him problems with heart failure, which was just the heart as a muscle, so that we're knowing that that was caused a problem from that. But as I say, it put him at a risk of falling, and then when he had an operation, it put him at risk of other complications occurring. And it's not that you wanted, I certainly thought it was the right thing to do to treat his prostate cancer, it's not saying that, but we do some quite complicated juggling, and this is where, as I say, the game of Kaplunk, which is the pick up sticks and through a pipe, which goes through the holes in the pipe. And those are all the things that give us resilience. As some of those systems begin to fail, we develop health conditions, we are more likely to become frail. Okay. One of the things that's really tricky when you're a hospital doctor is that you tend to remember the patients that you see in the hospital, not the patients that are living well that we don't have to see. And I guess that this is one of the things that's really important for me to remember, and for me to remember to remind you, is that while people can develop these problems, there's an awful lot of people that don't develop them. So that when people are 65, we might say about 10% of people have some signs of frailty. It does increase when you're over 85, but there are still a lot of people, still going to be 50% of people at 85 who aren't frail. Okay? And this is not a slide that I expect you to be able to read the numbers on, but this is the Rockwood Frailty Scale, and it talks about different levels of function, so that at level 1, you're not limited, you're not frail, and when you're up to level 9, that is that you are very frail and you are very dependent on other people. Okay, and this is on the physical side of things. There are some notes there that say that it's complicated again because it does interrelate with people with cognitive impairment as well. As a geriatrician, what I'm particularly interested in is the people who are in the middle area there, once they're beginning to become frail, because that's where we have the chance of making some differences for people, and maybe moving them from vulnerable, or stopping them progressing from vulnerable to mildly frail to moderately frail. When you get to the, as I say, the really frail end of things, certainly you might be going to be considering how different treatments might affect you. But this area is the group of people that we're particularly interested in seeing what we can do to make a difference. And one of the things that is, as I say, is big in frailty is the fact that we lose muscle strength. That's losing muscle, that's sarcopenia. Your muscles are shrinking. Okay, so proportionately, if you look at body composition of people as they get older, their muscle mass is decreasing, and your fat mass and your fibrous tissue mass proportionately increases. And I quite like this just as saying that, you know, it is all quite complicated. So this is obviously a simplification of everything as well. But so muscle mass, losing muscle mass, what things feed into that? So neurological problems, so that might be having a stroke or a head injury or something like that. Those neurological alterations may just affect the way that your brain functions or controls muscles. We know that if you're sedentary, so that's not being very active, that contributes to muscle loss. Inadequate nutrition. Inflammation. I think inflammation is really interesting. One of the things that happened when we locked down for COVID last year is we were in a lucky situation that COVID wasn't in the country at that stage, as we were seeing it in other places. But one of the things that happened is that our rates of people having heart attacks and strokes dropped considerably when we stopped them getting coughs and colds in winter. It was. I don't think I had thought about it in quite the way, but the hospitals weren't flooded in the way that we thought that we might have been going to be in that time because the COVID didn't come, but also that, the things that usually do happen, they weren't happening either, and we were just limiting the amount of inflammation by isolating. And it's not that I think that isolating is the way that we should be living. But we do need to get the balance right. We need to think about how that might impact. And it's not only inflammation from things like infections, but it might be inflammation from autoimmune conditions. So that's when your body is attacking itself. So something like rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, where your body reacts badly to itself. Those raise inflammatory markers and, as I say, make you much more likely to lose muscle mass. Hormonal changes are up there, and you'd think that we would have got better at managing some of these sorts of things. But these, as I say, they're very, very complicated systems. Often they work in a pulsatile way in the body so that hormones are released at different times, and the way that our body responds can be different at different times of the day. Steroids are one of the things that are up there, and people often know that when you sometimes do need to take steroids for some conditions to damp down autoimmune problems, but when you're doing that, that also affects things like your muscle strength. So it's a complicated wee business. We're fascinating creatures, amazingly made. It is just amazing to me. I think I've talked about most of the things that I wanted to say about the things for inflammation. I guess that the other thing about when we're thinking about this is that there are multiple things that will feed into it. And some of those are things like that we can't actually do very much about changing where we are at the moment. Like you can't actually change who your parents were, what genetic material you received from your parents, but that might add to your resilience. It might make you less resilient as well. But often what we're talking about is that there are multiple hits to the system. And I guess that the things that can be maybe a little bit positive thinking about that side of things are from the point of view of the neurological things, for instance. So if you have something that's affecting the way that nerve transmission happens to the muscles, you might still be able to make a difference to it by improving your activity and your resistance exercise work. So fighting in different areas for the things that you can't actually necessarily change in another area can be of benefit. And this is just, a little reminder to me about that we play with numbers as doctors and things like that, and I can tell you quite a lot about statistics that won't be necessarily relevant to you because you're special and not part of the same statistic. But this is one of the things that has been used, or they've used things like the frailty scales for, is for helping make decisions about whether a treatment is going to cause you more harm than being of benefit. And this is just an algorithm from the NHS about how people who are frail might be managed differently in the situation that they have COVID. Where is the best place to be looking after them? Is it right to be thinking about putting them on a ventilator, or is that going to be something that causes more problems in the long term? So the thing that's tricky about this is that, everyone is individual. And so while we can have an algorithm or a pattern that we might be going to try and follow, we need to think about it for a specific individual. So, cognitive impairment. Now, this is particularly the area where people say that they don't ever want to come and see me because of problems with cognitive impairment. It's also tricky because cognitive or mental frailty contributes to the frailty picture. Somebody who has significant memory problems is much more likely to fall over. We know that people with frailty are more likely to fall over, that there is a very complicated interaction. And as I think I was talking about things for my mum, the important thing to remember or think about with cognitive impairment is that it is a journey. It isn't... it's something that's going to be a progressive problem, but it doesn't mean that from the moment you get a diagnosis of having some memory problems that all is lost. I mean, you can have a lot of things. Your life can be still very, very fulfilling on the way through. So we look at it from mild cognitive impairment, so that's mild memory problems, through to much more end-stage dementia, where people are withdrawn, not able to talk, maybe that they not very mobile, they can almost curl up into what we call a fetal position. Those are things that happen, but they're very much at the end of stages of things. I think that it's also important to recognise that there are multiple aspects to cognition, so that there's things like your working memory, which is things that help you know who you are and your orientation to time and how you do various things is that, but there's also things about how you make decisions, process information, so that there can be different aspects that you may be showing deficits in. Sometimes people have a lot of problems with language, and that, as I say, is a tricky thing, but that's another area. They still might be able to manage other tasks, and sometimes but people can't manage verbal instructions, but they might still be able to follow written instructions, or they might still be able to, even if they can't read, they might still be able to deal with numbers and money and things like that. So there's lots of aspects to cognitive impairment. If you have memory problems that are beginning to impact on your day-to-day life, impact on the way that you do things, that's when we call it dementia. Okay, but it's not. It doesn't necessarily you've lost all functions. It's just in some areas it's impacting on your day-to-day life, and you may need more supports. Another of my favourite graphs. Now this one is sort of in the reverse to where previously, and I'm sorry, if I was very clever with graphics and things like that, I could have flipped it or done something. But this is saying normal, so this would be on my other graphs that it would have been at the high level of function and abnormal at the other end. And we're talking about, a problem here that there's increasing problems with dementia, but before that, we're seeing that there are, so this is where we might be seeing the problems that a patient's having or a person's having, but their memory might have in fact been more of a problem before that. And here we know that we might actually see changes. If we look at a CT scan or an MRI scan, we might see changes in the brain where there's some shrinkage of the brain. But that's happening, well before we're seeing the problems with somebody's clinical function. And looking back at these things, what we know about dementia is that there's damage to brain cells, and that cells are made up of proteins, and that there can be some abnormal proteins that form. So there are a number of different proteins that can cause problems with dementia. So amyloid is one of them, and that's particularly much more the problem in Alzheimer's disease. You have problems with Lewy bodies, which are like the damage that you can get to cells in Parkinson's disease, but when they affect other bits of your brain, it can end up with a dementing process. And we also know that there's another lot of proteins called tau proteins, and if those abnormal clusters occur, they will also cause problems with brain function. But this is one of the things is that there are certainly some conditions where there are genetic forms of dementia, which is really tricky because they tend to often have an earlier onset. But one of the things is that we don't know is that here we could be seeing increased levels of, this bit of the graph is about amyloid proteins. But is it going to actually go along there? How is it going to go? But you see that we need to probably be doing something about it well before somebody's got any memory problems to be able to make a difference. And I think this is one of the things that's really tricky about things, is that we don't always want to. We'd have to be maybe treating a lot of people, and we may well be causing problems when we're doing some of those treatments to have an impact. So, one of the things that's really still tricky about dementia is that we don't have a way of stopping dementia. We have things that you can do to limit risks, but we can't actually stop things. So, this is my little list of things that we can do to decrease the chances of developing problems with memory. So hopefully all being here and thinking about learning new things is important. So working on our education, learning new skills, keeping our brain active. But what we know is that people who achieve higher levels of education when they're younger, they are less likely to get memory problems than if you don't continue with education. So getting bright, staying bright, keeping your brain active. Really very sadly, you can't get away from the fact that probably we all need to think about our weight and exercise. Exercise seems to just be good for everything. So keeping as active as we can for as long as we can is an important thing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about diet, but I think that that's also been covered earlier in this seminar series. We do know that things like stress has an impact on your resilience as well. So learning ways of reducing stress, probably not drinking too much that's not a good necessarily way of reducing stress, but learning other ways of managing stress is good for keeping up with your brain function. And I'm going to talk a little bit about grief in a minute, because I think that that's another big stress in our lives. Protecting your brain as much as you can. Don't fight. Don't get head injuries. is a good start. So, we know that people who fight or that play lots of contact sports like rugby, we can be damaging brain cells with those. Wearing seatbelts and helmets when you're cycling and things like that, they're also ways of protecting your brain. Making sure that you can see and hear things is a really important part of things. So, keeping what you can do about your vision. So maybe, getting cataracts treated, having macular degeneration treated, those things help keep inputs going in visually. Similarly, hearing things, being able to be part of conversations is important. So this is why, it can be useful to maximise things like hearing. And, certainly those will help people. If we can maximise those things, that will help people who are having maybe some memory problems. Sleep is somehow an important part of the way that we deal with memories and activity in our brains. So good sleep hygiene is something that we encourage. It's also tricky because as people get older, some of the things that we know are that you are more likely to wake up in the night. Your sleep is not necessarily as deep. That is one of the things that changes with time. So people can often get really quite stressed about their sleep. What we do know is that managing ways without drugs is much better, that the medications that people often use for sleeping pills, they damage neurons. They're not good for it. So it's sleeping well, but probably without medications if we can do that. It might mean also treating things like depression that might be affecting your sleep patterns. Limiting alcohol and other drugs, they do often affect brain function as well. Not drinking too much is good. We know that, when you talk about things like the Mediterranean diet, everyone says, they drink red wine and it does seem to be good for you. Yes, they don't drink probably 5 litres of red wine. So we do need to be reasonable about those things. And maintaining social activities is really important. And I often say to people, it's a little bit like when you go to the gym. I don't go to the gym. If I went to the gym, I wouldn't want to just do push-ups. I wouldn't want to do any push-ups. But if I wouldn't want to just do push-ups or sit-ups or something like that, they'd only be using part of my body. It's like doing cross-training when you get together with other people and have social interactions. It's exercising lots of parts of your brain. And it's a really important thing. So staying connected with communities and your family is a helpful thing from a brain perspective. This is just reminding me that I've talked about all those things. Here are some people enjoying what is actually a nasty thing. Chess is a war game. I don't approve of war games, but it has lots of things in it. It's got set patterns that you're going to be remembering and using. It's got multi-dimensional things that uses another bit of your brain. Here they are, they're sitting outside playing this lot of chess, in fact, and obviously it's a social interaction as well. So here are some people doing well. They might be going to have a drink, they might just be going to have a coffee, they might have a drink, you never know. All good. So, as far as diet goes, there isn't actually a magic answer at the moment. I'm quite fascinated by gut flora, and I think this is going to explain a lot of things in the future. So it's just an area of interest to me. My advice is eating a rainbow is a good thing. So eating lots of brightly coloured fruit and vegetables seems to be good. A lot of plant-based diets seem to be better for lots of aspects of your health. But, as I say, eating a wide variety of things is probably most important, and it seems to be best to eat it as food, not just to be taking things as supplements. There are also some really important social interactions that occur around eating, and I think that they are sometimes overlooked. One of the things that we know about frailty is that it's to do with, we often see people losing weight when they're becoming frail. It's particularly weight of muscles that they're losing. So it's an extra risk. I have to say that we know that obesity puts you at risk for diabetes, hypertension, and some cancers, so that we know that probably not being overweight is important as well. So you have to find a happy medium here. The other things that we can help manage from a brain protective point of view is managing vascular risk factors, because we're talking about your heart and your brain here. It's very important that the blood goes to your brain. So not smoking, managing hypertension, controlling diabetes, probably dealing with your cholesterol and exercise are all important things. But there's also obviously big things that come in from your genetics and this interesting stuff about inflammation. So, thinking about the future is important, because we can do all the right things, and we can still end up with having some problems with limitation. I guess that there are some things that you need to think about from a material point of view as far as aging goes. And that can be around things like driving, because if you're dependent on needing an independent way of transport to do daily tasks, it might be something that's going to be limiting, because driving, unfortunately, can be one of the things that becomes tricky. It might become tricky because you can't see so well. It might be tricky because it's actually physically difficult to move your feet onto the right pedals in the car. All those things. But it also, would like to say that you could live at the top of a mountain or in the middle of a city and everything was going to be equal about the way that we did things. But in fact, it's not. It's harder if you live in a rural, isolated place, because it's, as well as being difficult to get the things that you need, it's difficult to put services in those settings. We're in a tricky situation. It's been highlighted by, I guess, COVID and not being able to travel around the world easily. The situation where your family is spread around the place, it, can have a significant impact on things. I'm quite a firm believer in, doing things that are important to you sooner rather than later. And I guess that was a little bit brought home to me with the situation that I was in with my husband, that I was very pleased that we chose to do good things together. Rather than just doing the boring things. And it was beneficial. One of the things that we'd always planned on doing was a Rhine River cruise. And when we told the oncologist this after John's chemotherapy, he said, actually, I don't think that that's going to be one of the things you can do. So we thought about how we might do that differently. And we went on a campervan holiday for 8 weeks around the South Island, which was just superb. One of the really good things about that turned out to be that we sat and talked about our lives, our childhood friends and things like that, and we talked about a lot of things that were really important to us. And John was able to tell me at that time that there were things that he didn't want to have operations that weren't going to give him quality of life, and that was really, really useful for me. When we got to the stage where he wasn't able to talk to me after a stroke, and it wasn't one of the things that I had envisaged when we were having those conversations, but it was such a precious time. I think that, it's very boring to talk about legal aspects. John would have, though, thought it was very important for me to mention them. Establishing or writing a will and establishing and enduring powers of attorney are things that we encourage. And as I say, I'm going to talk a little bit more about advanced care planning and what that is. So, the advanced care planning is particularly around health aspects of your care, and but it may well involve other aspects. And so, when's the right time to think about talking about advanced care planning? I mean, I like to think at the moment, that I'm up at the higher level of functioning and things like that. I don't know what the crisis that might occur in the future is going to be. It might be going to be something that happens very suddenly. It could be lots of things, now. So it almost makes it impossible to make a decision because it's such a complicated one. But I can say some things about things. So, for instance, when I was at medical school, I developed ulcerative colitis. It's one of those wonderful things that I got genetically. My mother's mother and my father's father had both had colitis and both had their large bowels removed, which is what I had done when I was 22. And one of the things that happened at that time for me is that to try and manage my nutrition, I was fed with a nasogastric tube. So a tube that goes down your nose and into your stomach. And it was nasty. I didn't like it. So one of the things I've said to my daughters is, I'm really very keen to avoid the situation where I'm fed with a nasogastric tube. I really don't like that. So that's one of the things that I have said in my advanced care plan. But then I thought, actually, I'm at a stage where my daughters are maybe thinking of producing grandchildren for me. This would be very exciting if it happened. And if I developed a condition like motor neurone disease at the time that my daughters were pregnant, would I want to do everything I could to stay alive for as long as I could to see my grandchildren at least being born? So, it's tricky. So that while I've got this very strong view that I didn't like my nasogastric tube, don't want that sort of feeding, in a situation where you have motor neurone disease, you might need artificial feeding. And one of the things that's important to consider is that I have a different view about that. And it will depend on my life situations. And this is one of the things that's important to recognise about advanced care planning is that it is it's useful to share the information, but to know that you can change it if the situations change is a really important thing. So it's not that you're putting things down and saying, that this is a no-go forever and ever. Okay? I don't know, when I think about something like this one, which might be about the chest infections and somebody with COPD, when is it useful to think about how things might go in the future? Do you want to go to hospital? Do you want to have IV antibiotics? Do you want to go to the intensive care unit? Those sorts of things might be things that come up. And I guess that when you have a health issue, talking about it with your doctor and knowing what might happen are really important things. It gives you knowledge. It gives you a better position to be in for making plans. And if you talk about it with somebody who's a health professional, they might be able to give you information that you wouldn't have thought about otherwise, and for reasons that you might make a plan then. Okay. As I say, it's really about aspects that are important to you and things that are important about the quality of life. You improve what we call your health literacy, what you know about options and things like that by having the discussions. Balance is really important to get the balances right. Know that it is a plan, but it's something that you can potentially change. And what's actually really, really important about it is actually having discussions with your nearest and dearest. It's not actually all about writing it down, but having the discussions about what's important. It will help people make decisions. And as I say, like when John and I were on our camper van trip, the things that we talked about were important in a situation that was very different than how we were envisaging things at that stage. I guess we were thinking about progression of his cancer. We weren't thinking about the situation where he might have a stroke. So being able to generalise some of those things is important. Okay. This is, a little bit of a joke saying that we are in a situation that life is a sexually transmitted terminal disease. But we do know one of the certain things is that we are going to die. Talking about death isn't necessarily going to make it happen any earlier or anything like that. The thing is that it might give you, in your one-shot situation, it might give you a really good death rather than not. As I say, we only really get a chance once for this. And I think that having a plan makes things very much easier for the people that are left making the decisions for you, so the people that you've appointed as your enduring power of attorney or just your family more generally. If they know that they can honour what you wanted, it makes can make a very difficult time much easier. I'm actually going to stop because I realise that I've rambled on a little bit. So I'm not going to talk so much about grief. It is something that I could, I can share my slides with you about grief if you were interested, but I'm going to stop there, I think. So I'd be very happy to take any questions. Right. Mike's there.
Oh, damn it. Okay, any questions? Any questions?
Yes, I'm just wondering whether you...
You're not allowed to ask me anything difficult, Bob.
No, I was just intrigued. Obviously, you can't cover the full material on grief, but if you give us some highlights from that, that would be good.
Okay. Oops. What did I do? Okay. From a perspective of grief, it's about loss and your response to loss. And we all, in fact, experience losses because that's my things. And I think one of the things that I said that's quite important about brain health and things like that is dealing with things like stress. And you can get stress if you're not dealing so well with losses and things like that as well. So I think that thinking about grief can be a really, really useful thing to do. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some really important work talking about that there were stages of grief. It's not things that you necessarily go through in a particular order, but that there are things that you might experience during grief. So denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and eventually ending up in a place of acceptance. But one of the things that we know is that actually giving meaning to life or things is a very important thing and will help you deal with the grief situation. So finding meaning, and I really think that that's part of what you work through with those different stages. One of the things that can be quite tricky about things that you lose is if you're in a partnership, losing a partner or partially losing a partner. So that for my dad, my mum's dementia was really, very significant. He's lost his confidant and partner, the person who shared roles and responsibilities with you. And I think that one of the things that's really quite hard about dementia is that there are just progressive losses. You experience lots of them. And I've on this one, I think that I've talking about some of the things that, might be things that you experience in that grief and loss process. Things like when you have a diagnosis made, maybe a diagnosis of cancer or maybe a diagnosis of dementia or something like that. I mean, there's going to be a loss there that you experience, but it can be, it can be different. So that somebody with cognitive problems, when they maybe can't be left alone anymore, they can't go off and do things individually, that will be another time that you might be promoted to think about loss. So as I say, within the dementing process, I can think of lots of things that come up there. And one of the things that is quite useful is that you can grieve in different ways, and there are people who are intuitive grievers, so that they're people that often feel sadness, inner pain, helplessness, hopelessness, guilt, anger, depression. There's more of their cluster of things into people that maybe are instrumental, who might have anxiety and agitation. They might become hyper-energetic, and that they'll immerse themselves in tasks. And I have to say that I would quite like to be an intuitive person, because that sort of sounds like it should be better. But I'm probably quite instrumental in my grief, so I like to do things to help deal with processes like that. And there's just some of the things that sometimes help people who are intuitive grievers. That's that first lot of cluster of things. So that discussing things in groups, being part of a support group, that could be something that's more useful for somebody who's an intuitive griever than it might be for an instrumental griever. Not to say that everyone is purely one or the other. For people who are instrumentals, doers of grief, practical information is possibly more important to us. It's sometimes if you can have a little project. One of the things that I would have said as a thing is when my mum went into care, as I say, she's almost lost her speech now. And I was thinking, in relation to the vibrant person that she was, this is quite a limitation. So I wrote a name tag for her door, made a name plate for her door, and I wrote in the background all the wonderful things that she was able to do. That she's a seed saver, she's a grandma, she's a sewer, she was very creative with lots of things. She was a great artist. All those things there in the background with her name on top of it, and that was, for me, was quite helpful for the process of her moving into care, to have a task that I could do that helped deal with it. And I guess that might be a little bit memorialising somebody as well. I have John's ashes at home. Spreading John's ashes has been interrupted by every COVID lockdown we've had, every time I've made a plan. So they're sitting at home, and I've put a couple of photos around them, and I'm actually quite used to them sitting there now. Now it's going to be quite hard for me to say I'm going to go and scatter them somewhere, because I'm used to them sitting there. I have to think about how that's maybe going to be. Yeah.
Okay, I'm still looking. Any other questions?
I can't have answered everyone's questions.
No.
Sorry, this isn't a question, but I had a meeting with an insurer a couple of years ago, and she gave the people in our group a copy of a living will. Could you understand that, and could you tell others that it's around for them to? You can get a copy of it, and it gives you ideas to think about for funerals and for care plans. It lays it out quite well. Did you know that existed?
Certainly, one of the things with advanced care planning is that sometimes people have called advanced care plans living wills. I think that I think it's really important that it's sort of quite open as far as what might be important and things like that for you. So as I say, I think that planning, having some discussion about what you might want at your funeral is actually very useful, because obviously that's a difficult time for everyone else. And if they can know that they're honouring you and things like that can be really good. But it's not always, some of the documents that are produced are a little bit, they're a little bit generalised actually. They say, if I ever became brain injured, don't feed me, or something like that, or, yeah. it's tricky. The other thing is that even with the end-of-life care bill now being part of law, is that you can't make an advance care plan about euthanasia unless, particularly if it's about when you are cognitively impaired, because that's specifically excluded from the Act and things like that. So it's important to have, it's good to have those discussions. It's important to find out what you can and you can't say, and for people to realise those things.
Okay, I have a question. You've talked a lot about the health aspect, declining physical and mental health and the impacts they might have. But there's issues presumably also with ageing, about the whole social side and isolation and so on. Have you anything to say in respect of that?
Certainly we know that isolation is bad, and I think that part of that is to do with this keeping your brain active side of things. And I think that one of the things that's tricky is that you're in a situation sometimes where you need to make some compromises. To express all your personality and things like that might have you living in a house that is actually terribly impractical if you develop mobility problems or something like that, or, as I say, the issues around your driving and things like that. You need to think about how you're going to meet all those needs, as well as some of
manage care sort of structures as opposed to independent living.
Well, I think that I think that we're going to be in a situation as we get older that we've maybe been in situations where we've been flatting before, and what we might need to think about is actually, should we go back to a flatting situation? Would that be a way of managing things rather than living alone in a little house? If we can maybe live together and other purpose-built facilities, as I say, thinking about how you're going to do things like your shopping, manage those sorts of things. So I think that, thinking about villages that people might live in, that's an important thing. And it's thinking about it and thinking about the possibilities is really good. I might just tell you a little story about my mum. Again, was one of the things, as I say, once we realised that there was some limiting things happening for her and that it was hard for my dad looking after her, I used to go up and spend a long weekend, once a month, so 4 days, a 4-day weekend, up with them. And initially my dad used to go away and have time out, but then it turned out that he quite liked catching up with me as well, which was very endearing of him. So he didn't go away, so we'd be there together, but I'd take my mum out to do things. And she, one of the things that she really worried about is she'd say, what if something happened to Peter, that's my dad, what would I do? And, part of the problem is that I'd have that question maybe 50 times a day sometimes. And I said, my answer, you practice an answer sometimes for these things, and I say, the situation is that I've built a house that I think you could come and live with me, and if something happened to Dad, that would be one of the things. So we talked a bit about it, and then she said, that's very nice. I think I'd like that. But if it didn't work, I could always go and live in one of these places as we were going past a rest home. And to me, that was just a really loving thing for her to say. All around that she, even though, she was worrying about a funny situation, with my dad not being there, having a conversation about how we might plan for the future, it made it very much easier when she did need to move into care, because we couldn't manage things to keep her dignified and safe at home any longer. Yeah.
Having worked in this area for several decades, do you see any social differences in the situation for older people?
I think one of the really big things is tricky is that our families are so dispersed that we don't live in communities very much. We don't know all our neighbours. You don't drop in on people in the same way that we did. They always sort of talk, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, actually, often it took a village to look after people when they were getting to the end of their lives as well. And I think that we're not necessarily kind all the time. We need to think about that a bit more.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, I will wrap up then now, and but to say thank you very much for that. I must admit, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and I think you've actually covered a lot, but the thing that struck me right from the beginning, you were speaking from the heart and your own personal circumstances, and I think for everyone here, these are things that obviously affect all of us and mean something very much to us. And so putting it across in that way and raising all the issues that often I think people wouldn't want to think about, it really is valuable, and I think it's been very helpful and very informative. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much indeed.
Now, I'm going to do an evil little thing here. One of the things is that the Dementia Foundation have produced a calendar this year. This is the first year that they've done this. It's Craig Potton's pictures. It's a nice calendar. It's available for $20, and I actually have some of them with me if anyone would like to buy a calendar. That all the profits go to the Dementia Foundation. So I have those here. So that's my little plug. Is that all right?
I was going to give that a plug as well. I'm going to buy one of those, but also we have a little something for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also to wrap up before the sales session, first of all, I'd like to give a thank you to a lot of the people who helped with this seminar series. Rosemary for the publicity, Ron for manning the door, Graham for the IT at the venue, Chris for doing the web IT. A very, very big thank you to Crossroads Church for all their overall technical things, giving us this marvellous venue, and for all their help with the setting up the YouTube streaming and so on. It's been great. And I don't know if you've been, I've been monitoring the numbers there, and there's been a lot of people watching either immediately or afterwards on there. So that's been a very big help. Thank you to you and to all the other speakers. Also, thank you very much to you as an audience. It wouldn't succeed without that. And just to give you a bit of advance notice, we're working on the next series, which will be the autumn seminar series, perhaps around next May, with ideas of a general theme in relation to nature and humankind. Are we making it better, worse, and how we interact with it, and so on. So hopefully we'll have 4 different very interesting perspectives on that in the autumn. Okay, thank you very much for coming and supporting the series, and take care and make all your end-of-life plans. Okay, thank you.